The smell of engine oil hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint scent of rubber and metal shavings. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting golden streaks over rows of tools neatly lined along the workbench. Each one had its own place, each one carried a story. The wrench with the worn handle that had loosened countless bolts. The screwdriver with a tiny dent in the grip from years of steady use. The rhythmic clink and clatter of metal on metal became the soundtrack of those early years, a sound so familiar it almost felt like a kind of music. The garage was more than a workplace, it was a world of its own, a space where problems arrived in the form of broken parts and left in the form of restored function. There was a certain satisfaction in that. The way a once dead engine could roar back to life under patient, skillful hands. Every day brought its own kind of puzzle. Some were small, like a loose belt or a worn-out gasket. Others were big, tangled knots of trouble, buried deep within the machinery, hidden from the eye and demanding a slow, deliberate search for the source. This work taught the value of patience. It was never about forcing a solution, but about listening to the hum of the motor, to the subtle vibration of a part not fitting quite right, to the quiet language machines seemed to speak if you paid close enough attention. There was a discipline in it, an order to be followed. First you diagnosed, then you prepared, then with steady hands you began the repair. It wasn't just about fixing cars, it was about learning how to approach life itself. Machines could be complicated, but they had a logic to them. You learned that if you stayed calm and worked through the problem step by step, you could almost always find the answer. That kind of thinking seeped into everything. The way you handled setbacks, the way you managed time, the way you approached even the most frustrating days. In a sense, the garage became a kind of school, teaching lessons not written in any book. And then there was the beauty of craft. Few things compared to the moment when all the pieces came together. You'd turn the key, hold your breath, and then that first spark, that deep, steady rumble. It was a reminder that what was once broken could be made whole again. That joy wasn't just in the finished job, but in the process itself, the grace on your hands, the smudges on your face, the ache in your back at the end of the day. They all told a story of effort, of work done with care. People came into the shop not just for repairs, but for reassurance. They trusted you. They'd hand over their keys and with them a piece of their daily lives. Without their car, they couldn't get to work, take their children to school, or visit loved ones. It was more than just metal and wires you were dealing with. It was people's livelihoods, their routines, their sense of safety. You learned to listen to their worries, to explain the problem in a way they could understand, to give them the comfort of knowing that someone was taking care of what mattered to them. In the process, you discovered that fixing a machine wasn't so different from caring for a person. Both required attention, understanding, and a willingness to see beyond the surface of the problem. In the quiet hours, when the shop was still and the only sound was the faint ticking of cooling engines, there was space to think. Sometimes those thoughts drifted beyond the day's work, beyond the next repair, the next customer, the next delivery of parts. There was a sense that these skills, these habits, were preparing you for something. You didn't know what yet, but the garage was shaping more than just the ability to fix an engine. It was shaping the way you saw the world, the way you understood the value of diligence, care, and commitment. The work was physical, but it touched something deeper, something you couldn't quite name yet, like a seed quietly growing in the soil of daily life, waiting for its moment to break through and reach for the light. There came a time when the familiar rhythm of the garage, once so satisfying, began to feel strangely hollow. The sound of clinking tools, the low hum of engines, the smell of oil and grease. All of it was still there, but it no longer filled the heart in the way it once had. The work was steady, the income enough to live on, and there was a sense of competence in knowing every step of the craft. Yet beneath that surface of routine, something deeper was stirring. It was a quiet restlessness, the kind that arrives without warning and lingers without explanation. At first, it was easy to ignore, to push aside with the next repair or the next customer's request. But as days passed, that inner voice only grew louder, asking questions that tools and engines could not answer. The mind began to wander during work. While tightening bolts or changing filters, thoughts would drift to places far beyond the shop. There was a sense that life had more to offer than the predictable cycles of repair and maintenance. The heart began to ask, is this all there is? Not in a spirit of ingratitude, but in an honest search for meaning. The satisfaction of a job well done was real, yet fleeting. Each completed repair simply led to another broken part, another task to be done, another day to be filled. Something was missing, not in the work itself, but in the deeper purpose behind it. Moments of reflection began to surface in unexpected times. Sometimes, while washing grease from tired hands at the end of the day, there would be a sudden awareness that the body was working, but the soul was waiting for something more. Other times, while driving home under the quiet stretch of evening sky, a strange longing would stir, not for rest, not for recognition, but for something beyond the reach of wrenches and gears. This longing was not easy to define, and perhaps that was why it persisted. There were conversations, too, that seemed to add weight to this growing unease. A customer would speak about loss, about joy, about hopes and disappointments, and there would be an undeniable pull to listen more deeply. Fixing their car felt important, but it was the moments when they shared their hearts that seemed to leave a lasting impression. Slowly, the realization emerged that people's lives were made up of far more than the mechanical things they relied on. The brokenness that truly mattered was not always made of metal, and the repairs they truly needed could not be done with tools. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when the world outside was still, the questions would return with more force. They were not questions about success or security. Those seemed too small compared to what was being stirred inside. These were questions about purpose, calling, and the reason for being here at all. There was a sense of being drawn towards something, though its shape was still unclear. Like a faint melody heard from a distance, it was beautiful but incomplete, pulling the heart forward without revealing its destination. Even in the busiest days, This restlessness found a way to make itself known. A pause before starting the engine, a lingering moment at the window, watching the light change, a sudden awareness that while the hands were busy, the soul was yearning for something unseen. It was as though life had been teaching skills, discipline, and attention to detail for years, yet those very things were meant to serve a purpose that had not yet been revealed. The mind began to wonder if the work of repairing machines was only one chapter of a much larger story, a story whose next pages were waiting, unwritten, beyond the walls of the garage, beyond the familiar comfort of well-worn tools, beyond the daily rhythm that had once seemed so complete, but now felt like only the beginning. The turning point did not arrive with fanfare or a grand announcement. It came quietly, almost unnoticed at first, like the first shift of wind before a storm or the faint glimmer of dawn before the sun fully rises. Life had been moving along its familiar tracks. Work at the garage, conversations with customers, the comfort of a routine that rarely demanded anything unexpected. But then, something happened. Perhaps it was a single conversation with someone whose words lingered far longer than expected. Perhaps it was a moment of loss when the fragility of life became more than just an idea. Or perhaps it was a still, quiet instant in prayer when the heart heard a whisper it could not ignore. Whatever its form, it was enough to begin changing the way the world looked. Suddenly, the routine that once felt safe began to feel like a cocoon that had become too small. Tasks that had been second nature now carried a strange weight, as if each bolt tightened and each part replaced was somehow asking the same silent question. Is this what you were made for? It wasn't dissatisfaction with the work itself. There was still pride in doing it well, but rather a dawning awareness that the skills, discipline, and patience learned here might have been given for a reason that stretched beyond the garage doors. The realization was unsettling, not because it was unwelcome, but because it hinted at change. And change meant stepping into the unknown. The mind began to hold on to moments differently. A customer's gratitude, a story of hardship shared over the counter, a glimpse of vulnerability in someone's eyes. These things lingered longer than the details of the repair job. There was a pull towards something more human, more eternal than the rhythm of mechanical work. It became clear that the truest satisfaction was not in the machine running again, but in the person behind the wheel feeling a little lighter, a little more cared for. This awareness began to grow roots, and with it, the sense that perhaps the calling was not to fix what was under the hood, but to tend to what was inside the heart. There were moments of resistance. The thought of leaving behind everything familiar was daunting. The garage had been a place of certainty, of tangible problems and tangible solutions. You could see what was broken, you could fix it, and you could see the results. But that the calling that began to whisper in the heart was not so straightforward. It asked for trust without a clear blueprint, for action without the guarantee of immediate success. It was like being handed a map without any landmarks, only a direction forward. In this period of questioning, there were also signs that seemed too timely to dismiss. A book handed over by a friend at just the right moment. A chance meeting with someone who spoke about their own journey of leaving one path to follow another. Words in a homily that seemed to pierce straight through the heart, as if they had been spoken directly to you. None of these things were enough on their own to change the course of life, but together they began to form a pattern, a thread of meaning that wove through days and weeks until it became impossible to ignore. It was not an easy thing to admit that the old life might be ending. There was fear of what others might think, fear of stepping into a role that felt far larger than anything previously imagined, fear of leaving behind security for uncertainty. And yet, alongside the fear, there was a strange peace. It came not from knowing all the answers, but from sensing that this was the right question to be asking. The thought that perhaps everything up to this point had been preparing the way was both humbling and electrifying. It was as if the tools of the trade, the lessons learned in grace and grit, had been shaping not only hands, but a heart that was now being asked to serve in a new way, a way that would require everything learned and more, a way that might transform not only the work, but the very life itself. Answering the call was not a single decision made in a moment, but rather a slow and steady surrender, like loosening a bolt that has been rusted in place for years. At first, the idea seemed almost impossible. How could someone who had spent years in the rhythm of oil changes and engine repairs suddenly step into the work of guiding souls and speaking about eternal truths? The leap felt too great, the gap too wide, yet the thought would not let go. It followed into the quiet of the night and slipped into the noise of the day, appearing even in the most ordinary moments. There was no escaping it. The more it was resisted, the more persistent it became, until it was no longer just a passing notion, but a reality that demanded a response. There was fear, deep and genuine, fear of failure, fear of ridicule, fear of stepping into something so unknown that the ground beneath might disappear entirely. The tools of a mechanic were solid, familiar and predictable. A wrench did what it was made to do. A screwdriver fit where it belonged. But the work that now seemed to be calling did not come with such clear instructions. How would one know what to say when a heart was breaking? How would one respond when the questions had no neat answers? How would one lead without knowing the path ahead? The weight of such responsibilities was almost too much to think about, yet alongside the fear came an undeniable sense of being drawn forward. It was as though the same discipline that had been built in the garage, the patience to face a stubborn problem, the perseverance to keep trying until the solution emerged, was now being asked to be applied to the realm of faith, compassion, and human need. The work might be different, but the attitude, the diligence, the willingness to serve, these could remain the same. That thought gave strength, even in the uncertainty. The first steps were small, quiet conversations with those who had already walked this path, tentative visits to places of study and prayer, late reading that stirred both excitement and humility. Each step carried a mixture of doubt and hope. There was no clear guarantee that this was the right move, yet there was a deeper assurance that not moving would be a greater loss. The call was not to certainty, but to trust, a trust that somehow the one who was calling would also equip, strengthen, and guide. Letting go of the garage was harder than expected. It was not only the work that was being left behind, but the identity that had been built around it. Friends and family had always known this life, had relied on these skills, had seen the comfort and stability it brought. To walk away meant facing their questions, their confusion, and perhaps even their disappointment. There was also the quiet grief of leaving behind something that had been good, even if it was no longer enough. But the pull toward the new life was stronger than the pull to stay. In moments of solitude, prayer became the anchor. The words were often simple, sometimes just a whispered plea for courage. There were no dramatic revelations, no visions to remove all doubt. But there was a steady sense of peace each time the decision to follow the call was reaffirmed. That peace, fragile yet persistent, was enough to take the next step. The journey into this new calling was not a sudden escape from fear or uncertainty. It was a daily choice to keep walking forward, even when the path was unclear. It was the willingness to exchange the comfort of the known for the possibility of something greater, something that might touch lives in ways that repairing engines never could. It was the realization that while tools could fix what was broken under the hood, there was a deeper brokenness in the world that needed hands, words, and a heart willing to serve in a completely different way. Training the hands for precision had been the work of years. But now there was a new kind of training ahead, one that reached far beyond the mechanics of fixing machines. In the garage, the work had always been about understanding how things fit together, how each piece had its purpose, and how one small misalignment could affect the entire system. That same principle began to reveal itself in this new chapter, but instead of gears and pistons, it was people, hearts, and the mysteries of faith that required understanding. The toolbox was no longer filled with metal tools, but with scripture, prayer, and the wisdom of those who had walked this path before. The early days of study were both exciting and humbling. It was one thing to know the ins and outs of an engine, to take it apart and put it back together with confidence. It was another thing entirely to explore the depths of human need, to sit with ancient words and wrestle with what they meant for the present day, to understand the weight of guiding someone in moments of loss, joy, or confusion. Books on theology replaced repair manuals, but the process felt oddly familiar. Just as in mechanics, there was a need to diagnose, to understand the root cause before attempting a solution. The difference was that now the problems were not made of steel and rubber, but of questions, doubts, and the unseen struggles of the soul. The same discipline learned in the garage proved essential here. Patience was as necessary in listening to someone's story as it was in coaxing a stubborn bull to turn. Attention to detail mattered, not the detail of a part number or a torque specification, but the detail in someone's words, the unspoken meanings in their tone, the emotions in their eyes. Where once there had been the whir of an engine as a sign of success, now there was the quiet peace in someone's heart, the faint smile of a person who felt understood. There was also the matter of humility. In mechanics, even with all the skill and knowledge in the world, there were moments when a problem refused to be solved quickly. Those moments demanded honesty, admitting when more time or help was needed. The same truth applied now. perhaps even more so. No one could claim to have all the answers to life's deepest questions, and to pretend otherwise would be a disservice to those seeking guidance. This new training required learning when to speak and when to remain silent, when to offer counsel, and when simply to be present. Hands that once turned wrenches now learned the gestures of blessing, the folding of fingers in prayer, the giving and receiving of the Eucharist. There was a beauty in the realization that these hands, trained for years to repair what was broken, could still be used for the same purpose, only now in a way that reached into the depths of the human spirit. The connection between the old work and the new became clearer with time. Both required skill, both required patience, both required the belief that what was broken could be restored. The training was not only intellectual but deeply personal. It asked for more than knowledge. It asked for transformation. Old habits of self-reliance began to give way to trust in God's guidance. Confidence in one's own ability was balanced by an awareness of dependence on grace. The hours spent in study and reflection were not just about preparation for a role, but about becoming someone who could live that role with authenticity. This was not about putting on the robes of a position, but about being changed from within so that the work ahead could be done with integrity and compassion. There were moments when the weight of the responsibility felt overwhelming, just as there had been moments in the garage when a repair seemed impossible. But here too, perseverance proved its worth. Each day was a chance to grow, to learn a little more, to listen a little better. And with each step forward, the realization deepened that this was not simply the learning of a new trade, but the shaping of a new life, one that carried forward the lessons of the past into a calling that was larger than anything once imagined. The transformation from the garage to the parish was gradual, yet profound, like the slow turning of a wheel that finally sets a new course in motion. The familiar world of engines, wrenches, and grease-stained hands had been replaced by a quiet reverence, a space filled not with the clatter of tools, but with the soft murmur of prayer and reflection. The workshop that once demanded attention to metal and machinery now gave way to a larger, invisible world where the brokenness to be repaired was not made of steel or rubber, but of hearts, spirits, and lives. This shift brought with it a new kind of work, one that required patience, compassion, and an understanding that outcomes were not always immediate or visible. The parish, in many ways, resembled the garage. There were problems to diagnose, solutions to seek, and care to be given. Yet the nature of the work had changed completely. Instead of listening for the subtle vibrations of an engine, there was listening for the unspoken pain in someone's words, or for the silent plea behind a hesitant question. The tools of this work were no longer wrenches and screwdrivers, but empathy, presence, and guidance. Just as a mechanic learned to understand the inner workings of a machine, so too did the priest learn to perceive the inner workings of human hearts with all their complexity, vulnerability, and potential for healing. The satisfaction of work remained, though it took a new form. Where once a successfully repaired engine brought a sense of accomplishment, now it was the quiet relief of someone feeling heard, the gentle smile of a person experiencing forgiveness or hope, or the warmth of a community gathered in shared faith. These moments carried a deep resonance, a realization that this work touched lives in ways that were subtle yet eternal. The joy was quieter than the roar of an engine, yet it was no less powerful. There was a profound beauty in knowing that efforts made here could ripple outward, far beyond what could be measured or seen. The transformation also brought a renewed sense of purpose. Every lesson learned in the garage, patience, diligence, attention to detail, care for what was fragile, found its place in this new mission. The years of mechanical work were not wasted. They had been a preparation, shaping hands, mind, and character for the service of others in a more spiritual and enduring way. There was a sense of continuity, a recognition that every experience, no matter how mundane it had seemed at the time, had contributed to the ability to serve effectively, to empathize deeply, and to act wisely. Yet this new work was not without challenges. Unlike machines, human hearts do not always respond predictably. There were moments of frustration, sorrow, and uncertainty. There were times when efforts seemed to have no immediate effect, when prayers felt unanswered, or when guidance appeared to fall on deaf ears. It required a different kind of perseverance, one grounded not in technical skill alone, but in faith, humility, and trust. The ability to continue despite setbacks, to keep showing up, and to keep believing in the possibility of restoration became the true measure of success. In this journey, there was also a profound sense of responsibility. Each interaction carried weight. Each word and gesture held significance. Unlike repairing a machine, where the outcome could be tested and confirmed, here the results were often hidden, known only to the heart and to God. This demanded sincerity, integrity, and a deep commitment to living the principles one sought to teach. The realization that the work was larger than any individual and that its impact could extend far beyond immediate perception brought both humility and courage. The new kind of repair work was not about fixing what was broken in a literal sense, but about nurturing, guiding, and restoring what had been lost or overlooked in the human experience. It was about mending relationships, fostering hope, and helping individuals discover strength and purpose within themselves. The hands that had once restored engines now offered comfort, counsel, and blessing. The daily tasks, though different in nature, carried the same essential truth that care, patience, and dedication could transform what seemed broken into something whole and renewed